begin, if you bought a book this evening at Anthology and you are missing a large set of keys, go on out and see Andrea out in the lobby because she's holding them for you. Well, hello again. My name is Mary Garn. On behalf of the Lackawanna County Library System, I am pleased to welcome you to the Scranton Cultural Center for the final event in the 2009 Library Lecture Series. The Library Lecture Series is made possible by the citizens of Lackawanna County and by the support of the Lackawanna County Commissioners and the Office of Arts and Culture. As always, we invite you to join us for autographs and refreshments after this evening's presentation, and our friends from Anthology will be outside selling books in the lobby throughout the presentation and afterwards as well. Our speaker for this evening is one of just 77 forensic anthropologists ever certified by the American Board. She is a member of the staff of the Laboratoire des Sciences Judiciaires et de Médecine Légale for the province of Quebec. She has served as a consultant to the Chief Medical Examiner of North Carolina and as an instructor for the FBI. She is also a professor of anthropology at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. Her first novel, Déjà Dead, was published in 1997. It became a New York Times bestseller and won that year's Ellis Award for Best First Novel. Since then, she has written 11 more books, and her newest, 206 Bones, has just been released. She also writes and produces for television. Since 2005, the fictional forensic anthropologist in her novels, Temperance Brennan, has been featured in a Fox television series called Bones. I guess you know it airs locally on Fox 56. Please join me in welcoming Kathy Reichs.
Thank you. Thank you. There we go. I'm breaking all your stuff here. If I go rolling off the stage, it's because this podium has a whole lot of give to it. You know, actually, we had this program going from the get-go. We just wanted to build a little suspense in here. Make you wonder what I would do if I had a whole hour to fill up here. Okay, we're going to talk tonight about forensic anthropology and how I take my science and convert that science into fiction in the form of the novels and the TV show. There's a lot of interest in forensic science these days. It's out there on the airways. There are what I think of as the mini documentaries. Then there are the fictional dramas, such as Quincy. I think it all goes back to Dr. Quincy. And the CSI Miami, CSI Las Vegas, CSI New York. I heard that CSI Mars is coming online. And each of these has its cast of characters. You have your crusty but dedicated detectives, and your idealistic but fair-minded prosecutors, and your cynical but compassionate medical examiners. There's good old Dr. Quincy. And of course, your quirky but brilliant forensic scientists. And often, one of those forensic scientists is the forensic anthropologist. Now, one of the myths that's perpetrated by some of these shows is that of the Lone Ranger working solo, when actually we all know that you work with your trusty team of helpers and supporters. So there I am with some of my fictional team. What the anthropologist does, I'm involved in what I think of as 3 phases of activity: recovery, identification, and the analysis of trauma. Recovery involves going out to the field or to the cemetery and recovering human remains to be brought back to the lab. Now that occurs under 2 contexts. One would be a situation in which remains have been discovered, either by hunters or campers or hikers or dogs or kids. And so we go out into the field, always with an official police team. I don't go off the way Tempe did in some of the early books on her own digging up bodies. I'm always with an official team. The second situation would be where there's been a request for an exhumation, a court order. For some reason, remains are being brought back, a coffin is being brought back up out of a cemetery, perhaps a family request, a court request, a coroner's order for some reason. There you see in the lower left one of those situations. That's Mike Bodden. I don't know if you know Mike Bodden. He's a fairly high-profile pathologist. Mike had his own show called Autopsy. Maybe he still does. On HBO for a while. It's totally black out there. I have this feeling that when the lights go back up, there will be no one here except the poor people who are stuck in the front row who will figure that I'll see them sneaking out. It's very popular right now to get involved in exhuming the famous but dead. I haven't done too many of these. They just did Zachary Taylor, and they did Lizzie Borden, and they did Meriwether Lewis. Mike has been involved in quite a few of those. I haven't done much of that. I did participate in a team that went over to Europe. They thought they'd discovered a coffin that held the remains of Mozart. It had always been thought Mozart was buried in a pauper's grave, but they found this coffin and it had a plaque and the date was right. So I was part of that team. We went over and brought the coffin back to a facility and did all the preliminaries and finally opened it, which is, the most exciting part of an exhumation, well, at least for me. I'm a little twisted. But the body was in there. It is a fairly traditional, what we call a Christian burial position with the arms crossed on the chest. And there was a lot of sheet music in the coffin, which was pretty exciting to the musicologist on the team. And as we did the preliminary x-rays and photographs and things, Mozart, the person purported to be Mozart, had actually been buried holding a writing implement, like a pencil, but holding it backwards. And as we were doing the x-rays and photos, that hand was twitching. Yeah, we were a little freaked out. And the eraser was moving across this sheet music. It was decomposing, right? I won't do that again. It's kind of fun to go to cemeteries. I always read the adjacent gravestones. I remember this one, the one next to where we were working, said, "Here lies an atheist, all dressed up and nowhere to go." So once I get the remains back to the lab, then the questions are, is it human? How long has that individual been dead? Who is it, of course, the question of identity. What was the manner of death? And then what happened to that individual after death? That's sometimes the key question in a case. Is it human or aminal? Aminal. That's easy for you to say. Usually, if you've got a fairly large chunk of bones, you can look at the details of the anatomy, or you might have to make microscopic slides if it's very fragmentary, and look at the histology. But there are some cases in which we get very bizarre-looking creatures, and no one's quite sure what it could be. We've been talking for years about what this might be. So I'm trying to make this a little interactive. I'm going to show you one. Actually, this is a specimen that was discovered not far from here in Pennsylvania. See what you think, animal or human. I'm going to try to offend everyone before I am an equal opportunity offender. But once I've determined that it is recent, it is human, I do then what's called the biological profile. I do very few positive identifications. Those are done by dental records or DNA. But if you have a completely unknown set of remains, you can't do that in a vacuum. You've got to have a name. You've got to know whose dentist to go to or whose family to go to get a comparative sample of DNA. So with a complete unknown, I'm often the first portal of entry for the police. So I give them what I think of as the biological profile, the sex, the age, the race, the height, any individual characteristics that can help the detective when he then goes to a missing persons list to see if he has a potential match. So one of the first things I determine from the skeleton is gender. The pelvis and the skull are the two most useful portions of the skeleton. The female pelvis has to accomplish certain things the male pelvis couldn't dream of in a lifetime, so there are certain changes in shape that take place around the time of puberty. If you look at the male skull on the upper left, you can see that the brow ridges above the orbits are are bigger, that the muscle attachments, such as the one at the back of the head, are bigger. The mandible is bigger. The male of the species often has bigger ideas too, but these rarely survive the decomposition process. I really debated whether to include this slide, and then I thought, no, this is Scranton, Pennsylvania. This is a sophisticated audience. The male of the species, whether it's a chimpanzee or a human, evolved a brain and a penis, and there's nothing wrong with showing that. Now, I've always found it curious that they also evolved a vascular system that only allows the use of one at a time, but the younger an individual at the time of death, the more precise I can be. With kids, they're still growing, their bones are still forming, their teeth are still emerging, so you can be precise within months of the actual age at death. The case in the middle is an interesting one. Those are one of the two little skeletons found in the Tower of London that were thought to be the two princes that were killed by Richard III. So we looked at the age to see if that was consistent with historic records. After about age 25, all of those developmental characteristics are done. All of the bones, all of the fiddly bits have fused together on the bones, and the teeth have emerged, and the roots have completed their development. After about 25, basically it's downhill. You're looking at degenerative changes. And Tempe's always talking about the pubic symphysial face. That's what you see on the lower left. That's the point where the two halves of the pelvis meet in front. And that surface undergoes regular change throughout adulthood. The ribs, where they attach via cartilage to the breastbone, undergo regular change throughout adulthood. And of course, the quality of the bone diminishes. So those are some of the kinds of things I look at with adults. And there, your plus-minus range is going to be much broader. Ancestry is a very complex question. We tend to talk in terms of the big three: Caucasoid, Negroid, Mongoloid, but it's much more complex than that. Any given area is going to have a wide range of variation in terms of racial background. Just as an example, I have a kind of a photographic overview of the local population of Scranton to show you how diverse your racial mixture can actually be. But the most useful area for determination of race is still the skull and the mid-facial architecture. There are certain differences between populations whose ancestors originated in Africa versus Asia or Native American versus European ancestry. So once I've determined, so those are all relevant to identity. Who was this person? Another question that I address is, well, what happened to this person? And in order to do that, I look at trauma in the bones. It's got to be something that would have left its mark on the bones. Blunt instrument trauma, for example, this gentleman got into a dispute with his son, who was schizophrenic. The son settled the argument with a 2x4. I might be asked how many blows, what type of weapon, what was the direction of blows, what was the sequence of blows. Sharp instrument trauma, you see that was a drug deal that went bad. Our American favorite down on the lower left, which is gunshot. I might be asked how many gunshot entrances, where's the entrance, where's the exit. If you know that, you know the trajectory, you can figure out where the shooter was, you can figure out where the victim was, etc. Animal damage. One of the things you have to sort out in looking at trauma is, did it occur at the time of death? Did it occur after death? If a body's left out in the open for any amount of time, there will be animal scavenging. It's rare that I'll see remains that have been outside that have not been gnawed upon by animals. In fact, if you are feeling unwell and you are at home, I recommend keeping Fido or Fluffy's bowl very full, because should you pass on to your mortal reward and they get desperate enough, they will begin scavenging. Now, this is my sanitized slide collection. My slides are infamous among my students, so this is the sanitized version. But if I don't put in one or two that are a little bit more graphic, then I get complaints about that. I will, however, try to warn you about those so that the more sensitive among you can avert your eyes. This is a particularly sad case that came into the lab shortly before I left. It's an overdose. Now, I had a professor in grad school who told us every good presentation should have a kitten, a puppy, and a baby. So we've taken care of the kitten is sleeping. The kitten is fine. There were no animals harmed in the making of this presentation. Okay, so what I do is I take my science, I take what I do in the lab, in the field, and I convert that into fiction. My first book was Deja Dead. I take actual cases as my core idea for a story, and then I go into what if. Well, what if this happened, and what if this happened? And then I spin off into fiction. I always change the names and the dates and the places and the details for both legal and ethical reasons. But Deja Dead began with a case in Montreal. Two women were killed and mutilated. Their bodies were found shortly after they died, so I was not involved in either of those cases. Upon the death of the second woman, the killer used her bank card. He went to an ATM machine. So the police located that machine and isolated that transaction, went to the little, it's a convenience store called a dépanneur up in Montreal, and there was a video machine, so they printed up a photo of the person that had used the victim's card, showed it to the store owner, and he said, well, I don't know him, but he comes in here all the time. So they staked out the store, and sure enough, within 6 hours, our hero showed up and was arrested. This was not the smartest serial killer on the planet. At that moment, when he was arrested, he admitted to having killed another woman 2 years earlier, cut her up, and buried her in 5 locations across the St. Lawrence River. So that was the case that I was involved in. By the way, for those of you that don't read French, le psychopathe, that means the psychopath. So this is our perpetrator is a man named Serge Archambault. The key question in that case wasn't identity. We pretty much knew who the victim was. So she was identified ultimately through dental records. But what came to be important in that case was the manner of dismemberment. Now normally when you dismember, well, not when you dismember a body, but when a perpetrator dismembers a body, they go about it usually for one of two reasons. One would be to minimize the possibility of identity. If you cut off the hands, cut off the head, you won't be able to use dental records, you won't have fingerprints. So that's one common reason. The second would be packaging, to be able to put the body into a smaller container. Canadians are crazy about hockey bags. They're always putting people into hockey bags. But usually the perpetrator is going to go about it in the easiest manner possible, the manner requiring the least expenditure of energy. And that means cutting off the limbs, above and below the joints, just whack off the arms and the legs. Well, I noted in this case, and this of course is before I knew who the suspect was, that the perpetrator had gone about it in a very distinct way, in that not with regard to the tool type. Now I can say something about tool type if it's a serrated knife or an axe. And if you remember Deja Dead, there's quite a lecture that Tempe gives to Andrew Ryan about all the different kinds of saws. They are saws that cut on the push versus the pull, saws with 32 teeth to the inch versus 18. Anyway, what I could tell in this case is that it was a straight edge knife. So I couldn't tell them much about the category of tool, but I could say something about the way the perpetrator went about it, in that he had gone directly into the joints. Now here you see the scapula, where it articulates with the upper arm bone, and on the right, that's the femur, the thigh bone, where it articulates very deep into a ball and socket joint. And the arrows point to cut marks. In other words, whoever did this knew something about anatomy. They knew what they were doing. They were going right into the joints. And I said to police, you're probably looking for someone with anatomical knowledge, maybe a butcher, maybe an orthopedic surgeon, maybe both. I was talking to the American Orthopedic Association last year and told that joke. I guess it's orthopedic humor. Anyway. As it turned out, Serge Archambault had been a butcher for a lengthy period of time, so that ended up being rather telling testimony. in that case. So I use that as kind of the core science. In each of the books, I try to do something different and use a different type of core science. And as a result, I'm always on the lookout for new kinds of forensic science. So when I was writing that book, one of my colleagues, a forensic dentist, was working on a bite mark case. Now, typically he works on bite marks that are left in the victims of violent sexual assault. Do you remember the Ted Bundy case? One of the key pieces of evidence in Ted Bundy's conviction was a bite mark that he had inflicted on one of the sorority girls down in Florida. So I thought, well, this is really interesting stuff. So there's quite a scene in Déjà Dead. The bite is in a medium other than human flesh, but it turns out to be condemning for the person involved. Bite marks, you know, my dental friends don't like for me to say this, but bite mark analysis can be really pretty easy. Especially if you have someone with very distinct dentition, such as that. But I do have to grant them that in cases, especially in cases where your perpetrator tries to disguise the dentition, for example, it can be kind of tricky, such as, okay, so we're done with the kitten, we're done with the puppy, we're done with the baby. Death du Jour was my second book. Death du Jour derived from two cases, and often I'll take two, sometimes even three, and blend them and have parallel stories going. Part of this came from a case that I did for the Catholic Church back in the mid-1990s. A woman named Jean Lebert died in 1714. And she has now been proposed for sainthood. So one of the steps in that process is that if there are remains, you verify that you have the proper human remains. So it was thought that Jean Lebert, and she was a fairly well-known personage back in 18th century Montreal. She was known as the recluse of Montreal. At age 18, she locked herself away for the rest of her life, and basically she sewed and she prayed. I don't know why you get to be a saint for that, but I didn't go into the theology of it. So they were now, and she was buried in this old church, but so were a number of other people. So they wanted to make sure, the diocese wanted to make sure that they had the proper remains. So they asked myself and a team to go in and bring her back into the church and do the analysis. So I got there early. It was really cold. It was late December. It's exactly as this book opens. It's freezing cold. So I slipped inside the back of the church and in the convent, I guess, and the nuns were having their morning meeting. And the Mother Superior was addressing the other nuns. I assumed she was explaining what was about to take place and why all of these coroner's vans and everything would be pulling up on the church grounds. And she said, "Sisters, we have a serious situation in the convent. We have a case of gonorrhea." And I know, I thought, whoa, I probably shouldn't be here. And this little nun jumped up in the back row and said, "Oh, thank God, I am so tired of Chardonnay." So that didn't really happen. So this is Jean Lebert, and she was in really pretty good shape after 275 years in the ground. And we did the analysis and the biological profile fit. We also found on her front dentition grooving, if you'll notice on the upper and lower central incisors. That's a marker of occupational stress. If you do something year after year after year repeatedly, it may leave its mark in the bones or teeth. And that was from the sewing, from year after year of pulling the thread. And if you look at her knees there, you can see arthritis. She also had arthritis on her toes where they hyperflex when you're kneeling. So we had the kneeling, presumably the praying, the sewing, the biological profile. We were quite confident we had Jean Lebert. But it got me wondering why a young woman would lock herself away for her entire life because of a commitment to an ideology. That same year in a chalet outside Montreal, out in the Laurentian foothills, a place called Marin Heights, there was a fire. And when firefighters went into the chalet, they recovered the badly charred remains of an adult male and an adult female. Those bodies came to our lab for analysis. A few days later, when things cooled down and the firefighters were able to go back in, they found in an unburned portion of the chalet the bodies of a man, a woman, and a 3-month-old infant. They were unburned, they were wrapped in plastic and stuffed behind a water heater. The man and woman had been slashed and stabbed. The infant had a wooden stake driven through its chest. Those were the first deaths in the Order of the Solar Temple. I don't know if you remember this group. Some 75 people died as a result of suicide and murder in the Solar Temple cult, most in France and Switzerland. The group was run by a man named Joe DeMambro. And Joe DeMambro controlled all reproduction within the group. A couple had had a baby without his permission, and DeMambro considered it the child, the Antichrist. So the group was going to make the crossing when they killed themselves and each other. They were going to make the crossing to the planet Sirius, which is a bad choice of destination since it's a star, not a planet, but I didn't get into the astronomy of it. But before they could make the crossing, the Antichrist had to be killed. So Joe DeMambro sent the 2 assassins to Quebec. They killed the baby, killed its parents, set the house on fire, and killed themselves. So that was the kickoff event. The next day, the mass murder-suicide took place in France, and Switzerland. So again, and I am in no way comparing the Catholic Church to a cult. Totally different things. But again, it got me thinking about how people's lives can be altered by commitment to some group or some belief system. So the book looks at cults and how cults who's vulnerable to that kind of recruitment, who they recruit, how they get their members to do these kinds of things. The science, and we had a number of these situations in the last several decades. The Branch Davidians under David Koresh out at Waco, Texas. The People's Temple. I think we're just coming up on celebrating an anniversary of that tragedy. Some 934 people died. The Heaven's Gate people out in San Diego. Interestingly, they were also going to the planet Sirius. Do you remember that one? They were going to catch the Hale-Bopp comet. And they're the ones that each had the roll of quarters, I guess, anticipating parking problems. So that's kind of the sociology of death du jour. The hard science is these guys, entomology. And from a forensic point of view, flies are really pretty cool. Basically, flies are looking for the same things we are. They're looking for good housing, a nice neighborhood, good place to raise the kids, supermarket close by, and a dead body is perfect. So within minutes of death, flies will arrive on a dead body unless access is prevented. So the females lay their eggs. The eggs then hatch into larvae called maggots. The maggots go through 3 life stages, and then they do what our kids do. They abandon home. They form these little brown casings called puparium, and they leave the body. So, and then eventually, inside those little puparial casings, they do what we hope our kids will do. Their molecules undergo a complete reorganization, and they emerge as adult flies. So I had 2 that went through that cycle beautifully, and I had one that was kind of stuck in that puparial stage for about. So if you know what species are present and what stage of the life cycle, you can determine PMI, post-mortem interval. How long has it been since death took place? So you probably learn more than you ever wanted to know about maggots in death du jour. Now, another area in which forensic anthropologists are involved is in the disaster recovery area. I'm a member of the DMORT system, Disaster Mortuary Operational Response Teams. Those are federal teams. They exist permanently, but they're only activated in cases of disasters with large numbers of fatalities. My DMORT team, for example, worked out, remember that genius down in Georgia who instead of cremating the bodies, he just kind of stacked them on the thinking nobody would notice? Yeah, the DMORT team from my district, they're the same as FEMA districts. Is that for me? Is that my mom? Hurricane Katrina, of course, but mostly we work on airline disasters. So I spent a year researching Fatal Voyage. I spent a year writing Fatal Voyage. It was released in August of 2001, and ironically in September of 2001, I found myself at Ground Zero doing exactly what I had just spent all of this time immersed in. So when you read the book, you learn a lot about what goes on at mass disasters, how family assistance centers are set up, how the families bring in ante-mortem records, how matching goes on with post-mortem records, etc. The idea, nothing ever goes well for our heroine. So as Tempe is working at this commercial airline disaster in this book, she finds a body part that could not have come from anyone on the plane that went down. So she's faced with this mystery: where did this body part come from and what's it doing up there on the mountain? That idea came to me from this case. This is a foot that was found on a downtown ice skating rink. It was a left foot. I told police age, sex, race, height, and I still have this foot. It's never yet been identified. But it gave me this idea: well, what if a body part turns up where it's not supposed to be? The science in this book is volatile fatty acids. That's the soup surrounding a body as it decomposes. Even if the body is not present, the volatile fatty acids can be trapped in the particles of soil. Volatile fatty acids decompose at a regular rate. It's predictable if you know climactic information. So it's also a very good indicator of post-mortem interval. Another area in which anthropologists are involved is the human rights domain and grave secrets visits. This area, this began back in the 1970s under a man named Clyde Snow, who became very involved in exhuming mass graves down in Argentina, trying to find the desaparecidos and returning them to their families. I've been involved in two situations involving human rights. One was the genocide tribunal in Rwanda. I testified in the tribunal. This is typical of some of the victims of that genocide in Rwanda. Typically what you'd see would be machete injuries, such as in the skull, and the lower skull would be a bullet wound entrance. The other place I did some human rights work was with Clyde Snow down in Guatemala. Some 100,000 to 200,000 people died there during the Civil War, which ended in 1996. Many of them women and children, many of them native Mayan peoples. So again, as that book opens, it's exactly as it took place when I was there in 2000. We were working up in the highlands. We were exhuming a grave which held 23 individuals, mostly women and children. The villagers would come down and watch us each day. You can see that they still wear the traditional Mayan textiles. They speak a dialogue of Mayan called Kachikal. The woman in the center, in the lower picture there, had 4 daughters and 9 grandchildren in the pit that we were exhuming. So it was a very, very moving experience. You can see as we would look up and see these young women with their babies on their backs wearing their traditional clothing, and then down in the pit you can see young women with their babies wearing the remnants of the traditional clothing. So it was quite moving for me. So this book opens with Tempe down in Guatemala doing some human rights work. When she is approached by the Guatemala City Police Department, a particularly attractive detective, they have a unique problem, and they have learned that Tempe has a unique skill. Now, I've had some feedback about the septic tank scene. They have a body in a septic tank, and they request Tempe's help. I had 2 septic tank cases, and therefore I felt it was time that my readers learn about the science of solid human waste disposal. You're welcome. This is the case that kind of inspired that part of the story. This is a woman who is interested in the Maya from an archaeological point of view. And as her 40th birthday present, her family sent her on a trip to visit the ruins. So she went to Belize and visited the ruins in Belize and Guatemala. For 2 weeks, she phoned her husband and said, "I'll be home on such and such a flight." She was not on that plane and was not seen again. 9 years later, these remains were found in the septic tank behind the hotel in Belize City where she'd been staying. So that was kind of the kernel idea that gave rise to the story. Now, I'm often asked if any of the characters in my books are real. They are not. They are composite characters with 2 exceptions, and that would be Birdie, my cat, and Boyd, my very well-behaved dog. You can see he doesn't get on the furniture, anything like that. And I use their slides because as I said, each book I want to try something different. And we're all pretty familiar now with DNA. I didn't want to just do DNA. So I used a case that involved the cat hair, mitochondrial DNA as extracted from cat hair, to tie a perpetrator or a victim to a particular place. So you'll learn a little bit about that in this book. Monday morning is something that's kind of been in the news recently. This one started out, again, we're back up to Montreal. It kind of started out funny. There's a building, a very old building, owned by a man named Gervais, French-Canadian. And in it was a pizza parlor run by a man named Said, North African individual. So Mr. Said one day was having trouble with the toilet, so he called a plumber. And the plumber came. When I was reading the police report that I get as a summary when my expertise are requested, I thought the guys were having fun with me. I thought they were making this up. So the plumber's name is Mr. Wong. Mr. Wong came to see what was wrong with the toilet. So Mr. Wong goes down. He's working on the toilet, and he notices a trap door. So he opens the trap door, he goes into the basement, and he finds a bone. So he goes up and he gets Mr. Said, and they look at this thing, and they look at this thing, and they decide, yeah, and they call Mr. Gervais. Mr. Gervais comes over. So the three of them, speaking God knows what language, this little international committee takes the bone to the library, and they get the library, and they get an artist-illustrated atlas of human anatomy. And they look through, and it's a femur, it's a thigh bone, it's a big honking bone. And they decide, indeed, it's human, and they call the police, and the police went in and gathered up the bones and brought them to me. And what came to my lab is what you see in the lower right-hand corner. So I said, okay, you've got 3 people here. Go back and get the rest. And normally that occurs pretty quickly. Well, they didn't get back to me, and they didn't get back. Finally, I called the detective, and I said, what's going on? It turned out the basement was crawling with rats, and as they were gathering these bones, one was on rodent patrol shooting rats, and the other was chucking this stuff into a box. So that's how this book opens. Our heroine is down in the cellar herself, and Luc Claudel is on rodent patrol. The key question in that case was, well, how long have these remains been down there? Are they 10 years old? Are they 50 years old? Are they 1,000 years old? Anything within the last couple of 100 years, you can't use carbon-14 dating, because once we started burning coal, basically after the Industrial Revolution, carbon-14 dating is no longer accurate. But there's a little permutation that is useful from a forensic point of view. Between about 1955 and 1963, when there was atmospheric testing of thermonuclear devices, you have a spike in the carbon-14. It's known as bomb carbon-14. So if you can pick that up, you can say basically if someone died before or after 1963. So that was the key question in the actual case, and that comes to be the key question in the case in the story as well. Now, part of the inspiration for this came from the story of a woman I read who went missing back in 1972. A woman in Northern California, a woman named Colleen Stan, was hitchhiking, and she was picked up by a man named Cameron Hooker. Cameron Hooker took her home and kept her in a box under his bed for 7 years. Even though she was allowed periods of freedom, alternating periods of freedom from time to time, she never tried to escape. We now know that that was because of the Stockholm Syndrome, in which you come to identify with or even feel affection for your captor. And we've had any number of these cases in the news recently, and of course the most recent being little J.C. Dugard in Antioch, California. So you learn a little bit about how the Stockholm Syndrome works. Crossbones, it was fun for me because I started out as an archaeologist. My background, my training was in bioarchaeology. It began with this photograph. This is a photograph of a skeleton that was excavated at Masada in Israel. Masada was a plateau out in the Judean desert. During the 1st century, when Palestine was occupied by the Romans, a group of Jewish zealots, they're called, went up and hunkered down up there, held off the Romans for 7 years. And this pissed the Romans off royally. So they brought in an entire legion. They eventually built a ramp up the side of the mountain. And when they broke through, all 900 plus individuals had committed suicide. So it's a very sacred site, especially to Israeli Jews. It was excavated in the 60s to great fanfare. Everything was reported. 2 or 3 little skeletons were found on the top of the plateau. Lots of reports about that, everything that was being found. This skeleton was never reported. Also, over the side of Masada, there's a cave on the southern tip, and in that cave, 25 fragmentary skeletons were found. Nothing was ever published. In the 9 volumes on Masada, nothing was ever mentioned about these fragmentary skeletons. My biblical archaeologist researcher and I managed to get the original field notes from the physical anthropology to whom this material was sent, and he was known for his lengthy and meticulous reports. And he never reported anything on this skeletal material. From his handwritten field notes and the counts for all the fragments he looked at, we could see he'd never even seen that fully articulated skeleton that you just viewed in the black and white photograph. So right away, that was a good enough mystery for me. Why was nothing ever published on this material? What happened to this material, and what happened to that one fully articulated skeleton? The other thing I used in this book is an ossuary. The first century Jewish burial custom in the Jerusalem area was to put the body in a tomb for 1 year, let it decompose, gather the bones, and place them for permanent burial in an ossuary, a small stone box like this one. So the valleys outside of Jerusalem, the Hinnom and Kidron valleys, are littered, honeycombed with these tombs. And also there are thousands of these ossuaries on the antiquities market. But in around 2000, one got a lot of attention, and it came to be known as the James ossuary, because written on the side of this ossuary were the words James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. Well, if this is actually the ossuary, James, of course, ran the church in Jerusalem following the death of Jesus Christ. Well, if this is actually his burial box, that's a big deal. So the Israeli Antiquity Authority convened a committee, they studied it, everyone agreed the box is genuine, 1st century, but they disagreed on the authenticity of the inscription. So I incorporate that also into the story. My biblical archaeologist, when he was in the Hinnom Valley shortly after the discovery of this thing, stumbled upon a recently looted tomb. And he is convinced, for way more evidence than I can go into here, that that ossuary came from that tomb. Well, if that's true, then that is Jesus' brother's tomb. That means that's probably the Jesus family tomb. That's huge archaeological news. We know the tomb is out. Biblical accounts say it's out there somewhere in one of those valleys. So I used all of that actual archaeological fact and wove it into a fictional account. So I had a lot of fun crawling around in tombs, visiting archaeological sites. On the upper right, that's Qumran, which is the site where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, meeting with the Israeli National Police forensic scientists, drinking a lot of bad tea with antiquities dealers, meeting forensic scientists at the Hadassah University also. Bones to Ashes, don't panic, I'm not going to go through every single book, but Bones to Ashes I think is probably to date my favorite, and it kind of gives you an idea of the process of writing. I sit on my process for writing, I sit on a National Police Services Advisory Board, and in case you're having trouble, that's me in the back row. And we advise to the National Police Services, which include the Intelligence Network, the National Police College, the National Forensic Sciences Laboratory, and among other things, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. So about the time I was beginning Book 11, we were briefed on the topic of child pornography on the internet. And I was struck by the importance of that topic and of that problem, and also the extent of that problem. So that came to be the main theme of Bones to Ashes. And when I thought of that, I thought of this case. This is the case of a child skeleton that came to me, how are we doing on time? That came to me in 1989. And it's never been identified. This is a little 6-year-old child. If you look at the dentition, you can see that the first permanent molar is just erupting. So I thought, okay, I'm going to incorporate this case. And since this skeleton was found on the border between Quebec and New Brunswick, so I thought, well, okay, I'm going to use New Brunswick as a setting, and that made me think of another case. New Brunswick is the home of the Acadian people. The Acadians are French-speaking people that today live in New Brunswick, which is an English language province. province. It's one of the Maritimes over east. This man, Raoul Legere, was the only Canadian killed in Guatemala during the Civil War. He was buried in an unmarked grave. His body was never autopsied. His sisters went to Guatemala because the National Film Board decided to make a documentary of Raoul's life. And this was 20 years after his death in 1982. And they became very curious about what had happened to their brother. So they arranged, after a great deal of difficulty, to have Raoul's remains flown back to Canada, and I did the autopsy. So in doing that, I got to know the Acadian people, and they are a wonderful, boisterous, fun-loving, generous people. So I decided to incorporate the Acadian culture into the book. In the 1700s, the Acadians were driven out of Canada. Their farms were forcibly confiscated, families were split up, they were thrown out of the country. Most of them ended up in New Orleans, in Louisiana, and became our Cajuns. That's where that term Cajun comes from. Okay, the other thing that I used in this book is, remember this guy? Okay, this guy wrote something called the Unabomber Manifesto, which was read by this guy. It was published in the New York Times and the Washington Post after a lot of debate. And of course, the Unabomber had gotten away for years with mailing bombs to initially university and airline personnel. And he killed people and blew people up. So the manifesto was published. It was a long, rambling diatribe about his reasons for blowing people up. And it was read by this gentleman who said, "I think I know who wrote that. It was my brother, Ted Kaczynski." And what happened then is they had a forensic linguistic analysis done. They looked at the content of the manifesto, whose authorship they didn't know, and they looked at things they knew had been written by Kaczynski. And they had a forensic linguist determine whether they were authored by the same person. So I thought, well, that's pretty cool. I'll use forensic linguistics in this book. Well, one of the few disciplines we don't have at the lab where I work is forensic linguistics, so I had to find a forensic linguist. Part of the story is that Tempe, this book starts out in Tempe's childhood. She has lost her brother, lost her father. She's moved to North Carolina. Her mother has moved her to North Carolina. She's 12 years old. She makes good friends with a little girl named Evangeline, who's an Acadian, and of course the poem, Evangeline, is about the Acadian expulsion from Canada. And when Tempe is 12 and Evangeline is 14, Evangeline disappears, and Tempe never sees her again. When she asks about her, she's told, don't look for her, she's dangerous. So we fast forward then, Tempe's in her lab, and a 14-year-old girl's remains are found on the border of Quebec and New Brunswick, and Tempe's afraid she's about to identify her long-lost friend. So poetry, as adolescents, the two girls had written poetry. So poetry turns up, and we move towards a linguistic comparison of the poetry known to have been written by Evangeline as a child and some later poetry. So I needed a forensic linguist to help me, and we don't have one at our lab. So I did what anyone does. I Googled forensic linguistics, and a guy's name kept coming up, Rob Leonard, at Hofstra University in New York. So I sent him an email and said, would you help me with the book? And he probably Googled me. And anyway, he wrote back and he said, sure. So we were well along in writing the poetry and doing the forensic linguistic analysis when I mentioned Rob's name to someone else. And they said, wait a minute, are you talking about the Rob Leonard? I said, what do you mean? It turns out Rob Leonard, my professor at Hofstra University, was one of the founding members of Sha Na Na. So I went out on the net and I found a clip of Sha Na Na playing at Woodstock. And I sent it to him and I said, Rob, is that you in the leather pants? And almost immediately I got an email back saying they were gold lame. And maybe an hour later I got another one saying, I loved those pants. In fact, he just told me in the new Woodstock movie that's out, at the end, they actually show a clip of him singing Teen Angel. And he said, I'd never seen that footage. I didn't know anybody had taken footage. So 40 years later, he actually sees himself for the first time performing. So that was a lot of fun. Okay, the other thing that's a lot of fun, of course, is the show. We've done a 180 flip around with the show. On the show, Temperance Brennan is a forensic anthropologist full-time by day, and in her spare time, she writes novels about a fictional anthropologist named Kathy Reichs. So we've done kind of this 180 flip around. So that's me sitting on set when we were filming, I think, the pilot, reading the mock-up, the prop correct right down to the author photo. Now I have to admit, the first time I went to Hollywood, I thought I was pretty cool. So I did my hair, I had it all poofed up and looked good. My executive producer said, well, I'll pick you up on the way to the lot. So he showed up in that. And I thought, well, okay, you know, so they said they had a trailer for me, so when I get there, there's the trailer, there I am with some of our writers, but you know you've really made the A-list when you get your own bathroom, so sure enough, there we go. So, but I did have my own chair. That was, you know, I am hot stuff. I've got my own chair. And then Emily Deschanel, who plays Tempe, came and told me that was her chair. But they did come up with my own chair. One of the things I do, my main role is I work with the writers. I help them in keeping the science honest. I also helped in constructing the set. We have 2 large sound lots on the Fox lot. We also film a little bit on location around Los Angeles. And you can see that I've really kept it accurate. That's Tempe's wonderful floor-to-ceiling backlit plexiglass storage facility. There's my storage facility at the lab. Our props are I've actually had people write to me and say, wow, they're really, do David and Emily really agree to work with dead bodies? And I have to explain that they're actually made out of acrylic because they are so authentic looking. You get a little more attached to some than to others. There we are with the lady in the lake. That's me on the far right. The lady in the lake is to my left. You get to meet a lot of interesting people. I actually agreed to, our executive producer asked me to be in an episode during season 2, and I said, no, I'm not an on-screen kind of gal. And he said, no, come on, do it. And I said, no, I'm not going to do it. And he said, well, I'll write the part. If you don't want to do it, I'll cast it. And I said, fine, but I'm not doing it. He said, David Duchovny's directing. I said, I'm there. So I got to sit around for a couple weeks with David Duchovny, and of course, it was the first episode also that Ryan O'Neal appeared in. My favorite, however, has to be Mr. ZZ Top, Billy Gibbons. That's Billy and my daughter and myself. So we have a lot of fun. A little bit more about the process of writing. I'm just starting my next book. So one of the things I usually begin with is setting. I set my books in Montreal, I set some in the Carolinas, but I also move around. So for the next one, I'm thinking of finding a place with a really nice and old, kind of turn of the century, 19th century, 20th century, 18th, 19th century downtown, place with really nice buildings. I'm thinking of some place that, yeah, maybe Pennsylvania would be a good setting. What would be really cool would be a city that names things after, like, drinkers, you know? Because like an electric city, all right. So maybe Scranton. So we'll set the next book in Scranton. So we want to put it someplace pretty cool. Let's see, I don't know, maybe set it at, I don't know, a old building that was actually partly a Masonic temple. That's in right now. I think there's a book on the list that uses Masonic something or other. And so we'll do that. But we should be more specific than that, because you've got to have your modus operandi. You've got to have your cause of death. What would be a good? Oh, I know. Let's do it in the ballroom with the candlestick. Okay. So then we need a victim. I don't know. Somebody who's beloved. Oh, I know. There's maybe a little disappointment with the choice of the speaker, a lot of hassle about the graphics or something. Tragic. Bludgeoned with a candlestick. Okay, so then of course the investigator. So we have the setting, we have the victim, we have the manner of death, then of course the investigation kicks in. The police would begin questioning people. Who are the most suspicious people you can think of? The librarians, of course. So, you know, they're not exactly cooperative. They stonewall. They stick, you know, librarians, they stick together. But the police are undaunted. They move on. But no, not a word. So finally, let's see, what can we have? We can have finally somebody cracks. And she said, I didn't do it. I don't know anything. I was reading. But I might have seen the victim with someone. arguing heatedly. Okay, so they bring this guy in for questioning. Let's see, how about this guy? But he has an alibi. He says, I wasn't even there. I wasn't even in town. I was at my country estate. All right, so they check it out. He's good. So the cops are really stumped. I mean, what do we do? So they go to Tempe, of course, and Tempe says, well, go to the victim's home, see what you can find. And they do. They find this book. Are you familiar with this? The Sweet Potato Queens? Sweet Potato Queens are these outrageous ladies that wear big hats and drink drinks with colorful umbrellas in them. But it's not just any Sweet Potato Queens book. There's actually a local chapter. Okay, so now we're getting at motive. You know, was there rivalry within the chapter? Was there perhaps someone who didn't want our victim to be a sweet potato queen? But more important, there's a clue, a fingerprint. Because we've got to have physical evidence, right? And that leads to our perpetrator. The head of the library board system. I thought I had everybody straightened out. So, okay, I get well along in the writing process, and it develops kind of like that as I go. I'm not someone who plots the whole thing out. And I'm pretty well along usually when I have to come up with a title because they want to begin doing cover art and marketing and catalog copy. So, I don't know, let's see, we had the sweet potato thing, maybe we could call it something like Silence. Okay, seriously, the new book is called 206 Bones. I think you're going to have to read that one because I am right at 8 o'clock on the dot. But I have a news announcement. This will be the first scoop, Scranton, Pennsylvania, of something new that I'm involved in. Coming next fall, viral. I'm going to be releasing a young adult series. So kids, tell all your friends. Parents, tell all your kids. It's going to be Tori Brennan, who is Temperance Brennan's 14-year-old niece, and her pals solving cold cases with simple forensics and also some rather special, unique characteristics. Okay, I have one slide left to show you. It really doesn't have much to do with, well, it has nothing to do with forensics, but it's my pride and joy, and I just wanted to share it with you. Thank you. Okay, I think we have time for questions. Where's the boss? Did I kill the boss? Is she?
We do have time for questions, and we have microphones set up on either side in the aisles, and we'd ask you to come forward to the microphones to ask your question so everyone can hear them.
And this will be on the test, so. Yes?
Dr. Wright, do you ever see Bones and Tempe Brennan getting in a real romantic situation, relationship?
No, wait. Are you talking about Bones and Tempe Brennan? Are you talking about Tempe Brennan and Ryan, or Tempe Brennan, young Tempe Brennan, and, see, that's a prequel.
Tempe Brennan and Seeley Booth.
And Seeley Booth, okay. Yeah, you can't, we go through this so many times when we sit around in writers' meetings, but I'm of the belief that once you do the deed, you're done. So the chemistry is so good, and to keep the chemistry going, I think we're going to keep it at that for a while.
Thank you.
Besides, she's got to go on, get older, meet Pete, get married, because the TV show is a prequel. It's like an earlier point in Tempe's life. She's in Washington, not yet in Montreal. Yes? Is there really a Seeley Booth? I wish there was. I've never worked there. I've got to tell you, I do.
Do you work with the FBI as far as that?
I haven't had too many cases with the FBI. I did teach annually a body recovery workshop in Quantico for the FBI Academy, so I interacted regularly with field agents on that.
Hi, I really like the fact that on the television show that Dr. Brennan is very unemotional, very logical, and not as cliche of a woman being too emotionally involved. And I was wondering, what did you base the character on? Is it an actual person? Because it seems nothing like you.
I'm sorry. We just wanted, okay, first of all, it's a character-based show. We did not want to have another CSI. So from the outset, we decided it would be a character-based show. And we did want some unique characters. We did kind of commit to the Asperger's idea with Zach. I've been asked if that's a characteristic of Tempe on the show. It's not. It's just that she was raised, and you can reconcile the show and the books if you just think of it as an earlier point in Tempe's life, except for backstory. They have given her this backstory of a rather dysfunctional family on TV. So she was raised such that she does not trust emotions. So she's a really complex character. They're there, she feels them, and this is coming out a bit more. And I think with each season, maybe she's showing it a little bit more, maybe we're getting to know her better a little bit more. But hopefully she'll keep growing. Did that answer your question? Yes. Over here?
Oh, okay. Can I ask you one more question?
Uh-huh.
Can I ask you one more question? What happens with the Mozart case that you were talking about?
Oh, I just made that up. It was a joke for a very, very bad pun. It was a very long joke for one really bad pun. He decomposed. Yes.
The TV show, all right? The characters, like the one that said, how did Zach and Angela and everyone come to mind?
Really,
the differences, how they blend together and their relationships.
well, it's hard work. Most of that came from, we have 9 full-time writers. So I work on each script, but I don't write the episode, well, I'm writing one right now. So they come up with the story ideas. In each show, we try to visit a different arena. The arena of, I don't know, what have we done? Plastic surgery, to a pathological point, or the arena of transplants. Yeah. Anyway, so the writer comes up with the episode plot. There are then arcing storylines as well. So we wanted a group of unique characteristics, of unique characters, each of which was slightly different, but who blended together because of their differences.
I mean, just the way that the characters were laughing at one period, you could cry at another, and it's just a well-programmed show. My son is a microbiologist, and I got him involved watching the program, and he was very surprised at how accurate.
Well, those were 2 commitments from the outset.
As the forensics and different things went on in the show.
Good, okay. Good, because that's my job, is I work with the writers mainly to keep the science honest. But from the outset, we were committed, number 1, to having a sense of humor. And that's important to me in the books, and I wanted that in the show. And that's hard. I mean, that's a balancing act. You're dealing with a very dark subject, violent death. So how do you bring humor into that without being offensive or flippant? So that takes work. And then as far as the keeping the science honest, that was one of my prerequisites when I agreed to option the character. Thank you.
I hope it stays on for quite a
Well,
while.
we've been picked up, we're in season 5, we'll be picked up for season 6. Virtually no TV show goes beyond 7, so we'll see.
Just one preface before my question, a little comment. If you're familiar with the old Jump the Shark website, that
Have
that
we,
you did it was one of the biggest categories for jumping the shark.
how did we jump the shark?
No, you haven't yet.
Oh, we haven't, okay. We will.
Just caution. Question I've always had is, why is there such a disparity between backstories of TV show and the books? I mean, you never reconcile it.
Yeah, you've got a lot of masters in TV. Every script idea, every script, everything has to be approved by the executive producers, the network, and the studio. And they all have different interests. The studio makes its money in a very different way from the way the networks make their money. Wait a minute, I lost track of your...
No, what I meant,
Why is it different?
How can you from the book who lost his father at an early age, has one sister living and brother who died in infancy, how did that end up, how did it come to the TV series?
Yeah, a lot of that came...
You did this with one brother who's still living.
I optioned the character, and a lot of what they did with the character came from the minds of the executive producers. And they make their decisions based on what they feel will be better from a marketing perspective, what will have more general appeal. Washington, D.C., they felt was of more general appeal than Charlotte, North Carolina, or Montreal. It was also not taken because the West Wing was going off the air, so it was sort of open. So there are a lot of different factors that play into those kinds of decisions.
This is not a question as much as it is a comment. My wife and I came here tonight to thank you for something. We're both retired teachers, and we've had some experience in television. There's something that you're writing in your program does that I think is really vital to our country. You establish models of incredible relationships. As a matter of fact, when we watch your show, we're really impressed by how much of a teacher you are in pointing out very valuable relationships and values between your characters. At a time when we're losing our humanness because of what's going on in a larger society, watching the relationship between Bones and Booth, for example, or between the members of your team, even though it's fantasy, but we just finished watching The Dwarf in the Dirt. And the story that was told about the relationship between the two main characters, including the psychologist and helping them understand, I said to my wife at the end of that program, and I hope you don't laugh at this, but every couple who is contemplating marriage should watch that episode.
Oh, well, thank you.
Because it points out many beautiful things that need to be in a relationship to make a relationship work. So to make a long story short, my wife and I thank you for what you do.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you. I'm writing an episode, and this is secret, but it's going to have witches in it. So I was researching some kind of disease process that might actually make a person look green, kind of like the good witch and the bad witch kind of thing. And then the coordinating producer said, "Oh no, you can't do green. We're having an episode with a green skeleton." So that was the episode last night. So, yes.
Dr. Reichs, I have loved your books since maybe the second or third one came out, and the show was great, but I really hope it drives people towards your books because I enjoy them so much more.
Thank you. Thank you.
My question to you actually, I enjoy how in each book you teach the reader something different, like carbon-14 dating or the insect or that kind of thing. How do you determine what to teach? You just look at the storyline and say, gee, what haven't I done yet?
Well, partly, yeah. What science haven't I used? What would be of interest? What might be coming down the pike in the news? And it's a little creepy because I'll write a book and then that'll all of a sudden pop up in the news afterwards. And that's the hardest part, I think, is writing science. And the woman that came to be my editor said that when they told her a submission had come in from a professor, scientist, she, kind of rolled her eyes because scientists and professors tend to way overwrite the science. So you've got to keep it short, And you've got to keep it jargon-free. You know, we have all these terms we use with each other that would bore the general public and lose them. And you've got to keep it entertaining. And that really is the key, I think, to putting science into either on television or into... They're the same skills, I think, that I use in addressing a jury. You don't want to dumb it down, but you want to make it understanding, and you want to keep understandable, and you want to keep people's interest. So that's what I try to do, and just take whichever science it is and do that kind of explanation. Okay, you and you, that's it, we're done.
Well, I want a question. First, I want to thank you so much for the incredible effort you made to personalize this slideshow.
Oh.
It was not out of the box, and I know it's a lot of
Thanks, John. There's always, I said to Mary as we were coming in, oh, I hope people have a sense of humor, because there's always that one horrible moment when you think, oh God, you know, what if they don't like it?
But I'd like to give you a softball question. Could you talk a bit about your creative process? Is it like aha, or do you grind it out, or the spits and starts? How does it really happen when you put it down?
Well, I'm on a book-a-year contract, so I don't have the luxury of you know, cogitating and taking 5 years. I do write a book each year, so I have to be very organized. I do work on the computer. I usually start with some case, something that's triggered an idea in my mind. I then choose the setting, very much what we talked about. I have my core cast of characters, so that's a given. And then I kind of do that what if thing. Well, okay, what if we went this way? What if we went that way? What if we went that way? I keep an outline as I go. I don't outline the way I used to with the first couple of books. I had quite one paragraph for each chapter. I don't do that anymore. It's more of a free flow process for me. I know there are writers that can't work that way, that I've become friends with R.L. Stine, who's a children's writer, and Bob does multi-page outlines before he starts a book. I don't work that way. So I write whenever I can. I don't have the luxury of saying, oh, it's a bad day. Every single day that it's a free day, that I'm not in court or at the lab or on tour, I write all day. I write from about 8 in the morning until 5 or 6 at night. I break for lunch and go to the gym and, yeah, right.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And the last question.
What made you so interested in becoming a forensic anthropologist?
What made me interested in becoming a forensic anthropologist? Absolutely nothing. As I said earlier, I trained to do archaeology. My PhD is in bioarchaeology, the paleopathology and paleoepidemiology of 2 lower Illinois River Valley Hopewellian populations. Has anyone read that? That's my dissertation. But that was, I won't tell you how far back, but it was long enough ago that we did not have this process of board certification. And the importance of, which I drone on and on about in 206 Bones, it's the theme of that book, the importance of legitimizing an expert really wasn't recognized. So when cops would find bones, they didn't know what to do with them. So they'd say, well, take them out to that bones lady at the university. And that's how I started doing casework. And once I started doing the coroner medical examiner work, at least for me, I found it more compelling. Not that archaeology isn't fascinating, but if you're wrong, you're not going to impact someone's life. Whereas when you identify a missing child or a missing, mother or husband, you will. Or when you testify in court, you will impact someone's life. So I like the relevance of that. So I retrained, I took my boards and have never looked back. Thank you. Thank you all. You've been a great audience.